Hey, this is Mark Farnham from Apologetics for the Church, and an Every Believer Confident podcast. It's going to be different than normal, and this is because this podcast episode is going to look at a key figure and key book in our modern evangelical state. As you may know, we live in a weird American evangelical setting these days. Of course, there's many faithful churches preaching the gospel, reaching the lost, worshiping God faithfully. But increasingly, we live in a world where progressive Christians, quote unquote, are embracing LGBTQ, even abortion, interpreting the Bible through a queer lens, advocating for political disorder and sometimes even violence, openly embracing socialism and rejecting capitalism as inherently evil, openly embracing radical ideas like open borders and redistribution of wealth. On the other hand, we have a whole host of really popular megachurches that are built on this really pragmatic idea that, we just want to bring people in, and their concept of salvation is just to get people to embrace Jesus in a general kind of spiritually religious way, but they have no concern for theology, sound doctrine. I know because I've spoken to some that have been on staff there where they've been forbidden to get deep into theological issues, including, don't talk about hell, don't talk about judgment. We just want to welcome people into the life of Jesus. You have what I would call, living in Lancaster County, an Anabaptist strain of churches that are really all over the country, but is really prominent here in Lancaster County, where we don't want to talk about anything controversial, preach the word faithfully, take a generally conservative stand on theology and culture, but we certainly don't want to go too deep into theology and the scriptures. And so it's just what I would consider starvation diet week by week of just a nice little surface look at the word and some practical advice. We have the Pentecostal charismatic branch that is looking for signs and wonders and resurrecting the idea of apostles and prophets today. You have, along with that, the prosperity gospel of pastors like Ed Young Jr. driving his Ferrari onto the stage at his church. And this has been exported around the world, where you have people in the most poverty-stricken areas being told by pastors of megachurches that if they are faithful and sow the seed of generosity, that God will too, as he does the pastor, give them a Bentley or a Rolls Royce or multiple $1 million mansions. It's weird times. And if you're in a faithful Bible church and you're not paying attention to what's going on outside your own church, this might be a surprise to you. But my guess, with the advent of social media, this is not a surprise to anyone, because you see the reels that come up. Churches that put on big shows and, Sunday at the movies and massive elaborate sets and flying pastors with, tethered to wires descending from the ceiling. We just have quite a variety. And to understand this, you need to know that 30 years ago or so, this was not the case, not to glorify in any way the 1990s. But a lot of this stuff was just getting started, but it had not reached the ridiculous levels that we are at today. And the reason that we became more aware of this was primarily because of one man, many people involved, but one man especially, and one book, David Wells, professor at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary north of Boston, and his book, 1993 book, No Place for Truth, or Whatever Happened to Evangelical Theology. This book, I remember reading this my last year of seminary, and then a few years later, attending Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. At that time, I was a pastor in Connecticut, and being able to sit in David Wells' class and realizing this guy has his finger on the pulse of what's going on and is also a good prognosticator, not a prophet, but a good person, with his ear to the ground and watching the times that can predict the kind of stuff that's going to happen. And so I want to kind of just look through this book, No Place for Truth, because out of this book came the Alliance for Confessing Evangelicals. Out of this book came the Cambridge Declaration, which was a declaration of some key evangelical scholars at that time, people like James Montgomery Boyce at 10th Presbyterian in Philadelphia, Alistair Begg, Robert Godfrey, the church historian, Michael Horton, Al Mohler, John MacArthur, R.C. Sproul, and others wrote the Cambridge Declaration, which presented theses, statements, which distinguished us as conservative evangelicals who believe the gospel from liberalism, Roman Catholic Church, charismatic and Pentecostals, and really laid the foundation of a conservative resurgence among evangelical Christians. Part of this included Al Mohler's election to the president of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, which began a huge backlash against the direction of liberalism that denomination, Southern Baptist Convention, had been going for many decades. You have the resurgence of several other institutions and the growth of conservative theology, conservative evangelical church planting and pastoring. Out of that grows Nine Marks and Mark Dever, Capitol Hill Baptist Church. Many other conservative theological movements and individuals and influencers, if we can use that term, that help to restore to a lot of churches who are wavering, a lot of churches who are weak, a strength and a commitment to the principles of the Reformation: sola scriptura, sola gratia, salvation by grace alone, sola fide, salvation by faith alone, sola Christus, and sola Deo Gloria, to the glory of God alone. Around this time, you have the emergence of people like John Piper and others who promote this idea of God's glory is the greatest good, and the purpose of the Christian life is to come to know him and enjoy him forever. And we could go on mentioning the different people that began to gain prominence around this time. And it was not a coincidence that this happens also around the time of the beginning of the internet and the spread of Reformed theology, conservative theology, return to an interest in theology. I became a pastor in Connecticut in 1995 in New London, Connecticut. And there was a group started by pastors in southeastern Connecticut called Theology Still Matters. And I remember attending those and having just graduated seminary, was hungering for more. And really in this book, No Place for Truth, David Wells captures the state of American Christianity in the 80s and 90s in a way that almost no one else did quite so clearly. So I want to talk through this book. This is going to be a longer video. It's going to be boring to some people, but the truth is David Wells is in his late 80s, and I'm hoping to do a video on each of the 4 books. He wrote a quadrilogy, if that's the word, No Place for Truth, and then 3 other books after this, and then summarize them in a final book, which was the summary of the first 4, called The Courage to be Protestant. And I'm going to do several videos on this because my guess is David Wells will probably go home to be with the Lord in the next few years. And the truth is, many people today, especially younger pastors, theologians, are not aware of David Wells and the influence that he had. And I remember this, David Wells and this book and his writing shaping me so much to gain conviction. And that's one of the points in this book, No Place for Truth, is David Wells gives the stunning indictment that American Christian evangelicalism had lost conviction. And I'll tell you what, 33 years later, I see it all over the place. Pastors who do not have the conviction to call out the evils of our day, to preach on sin, to say theology matters, so I'm going to through my preaching and teaching, disciple my people beyond just a surface knowledge of the Christian faith and the Bible. I tell you, we are still in the day of a complete lack of conviction in most churches and among most pastors. And I'm talking about the good churches, the good pastors. And so let's dive in. So in No Place for Truth, whatever happened to evangelical theology, one of the things Wells is dealing with in this book is the rise of postmodernism. And the truth is, postmodernism has come and gone. It's been dead for a long time in philosophical circles because it could not sustain its own principles of suspicion toward any authority, toward any text. And once people began applying that to the postmodernists' own writings, then that was the death of that. Although there's still a lot of in the popular level, postmodern thinking among people. No absolute truth, no absolute morals, suspicion of authority, suspicion of anyone who claims to know the truth. That's still around at the popular level. So he deals with that a little bit, but that's not primarily what this book is about. A really helpful thing he does early on is he defines key terms, including terms like modernization and modernity. He distinguishes those, and the difference between secularism and secularization. So let's take a look at some of these definitions as a start. He begins by giving the definition of modernization. He said, modernization involves a process of social change that has resulted in our urban-centered life. And I would say even more than that, now 33 years later, our technology-centered life. Wells talks about technology in this book, but no one could have foreseen, quite like it is today, the dominance of technology in our world today. So modernization is all about that. And certainly in our day and age, books and authors and thinkers, the classic 20th century thinker is the French author Jacques Ellul and his book, The Technological Society. But more recently, the book Against the Machine. Read that book, Paul Kingsnorth, Against the Machine. It's incredible. We also are well aware of Jonathan Haidt's The Anxious Generation. All these books talk about the stunning impact that technology has on our lives and how much it's changed our lives. So that's modernization. But he talks about modernity. He said modernity involves the values that arise from these social changes. So modernity is about the values. Think about the values that has risen because of the technological age. The value of exalting myself on social media. The ambition of many young people today is to become an influencer, to become famous, to have people recognize them. That's one of the values of modernity. So it involves the values that arise from these social changes, values that seem, despite their relativity and anti-religious bias, to offer the only appropriate ways of looking at life amid the technological pyramid. See, he mentions technology that we are building. Just think about how that's influenced the Christian world, the church. How many Christians, so claimed, that go to church every week, post constant pictures of themselves. They're so self-obsessed, and they want people to notice selfies. I see middle-aged women posting selfies constantly, hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of pictures on their social media of themselves. There's something wrong with that. That is a narcissistic, self-centered, proud, perhaps insecure value. They're not exalting Christ. Oh, sure, in their caption, they talk about Christ, but it's always pictures of themselves. And not just like, hey, I'm on vacation or I'm touring Europe. Look at me next to the pyramids or next to the Louvre or the Eiffel Tower or Big Ben. It's just pictures of themselves. Or the value that many pastors have today to become social media stars, to become famous. And so there's constant posting of pictures and videos and reels of themselves doing things. They're building a platform. This is the kind of values that that David Wells is highlighting as problematic because it's in direct conflict with Christian values. Think about Martin Luther. He wrote 500 years ago, talking about pastors, preachers, ministers of glory. That is, there were some people that had this idea of promoting themselves, theologians of glory versus theologians of the cross, those willing to humble themselves, to die for their faith. I tell you, we don't have a lot of Christians of the cross these days. We have a lot of Christians of glory, and it's their own glory. And I'm tempted by that too. Anybody who posts on the internet is tempted by, what can I do to increase my viewership? I remember a really wise friend of mine, Jason, who is in marketing, said, Mark, you have to decide, are you going to focus on engagement, getting the most number of people to follow you? And if so, then you're going to have to promote yourself relentlessly, or is your value going to be equipping the saints in the ministry of apologetics for the church? Well, I can tell you we have decisively gone the direction of what can we do to equip? We have to engage. We have to put our videos and stuff out there, but that's not our highest value. We're not trying to gain followers. Our viewership, quite frankly, is pretty minimal. But our hope is to, by our resources, equip many Christians to engage unbelievers with the gospel. So I don't want to stray too far from Wells's book here because I want to focus on that. He also talks a lot about the secular here. And of course, we've been talking about the secular for 30, 40 years, but you need to understand what the secular is. It is the pushing to the margins of life and society, God. That's what a secular world is. It's saying, listen, if you want to be a Christian and have your worship services and all that stuff, keep that to yourself. Push that to the side because real life is secular. It's apart from the life of God. He says this, it is axiomatic or considered to be basically common sense that secularism strips life of the divine, but it is important to see that it does so by relocating the divine in that part of life which is very private. Think about how many Christians go to church on Sundays and they sing their hearts out and they are moved, but when it comes to Monday morning at work, they keep it bottled up inside because we have gotten used to our secular society pressuring us. Think about a social worker, a counselor, a doctor, a teacher who cannot bring up their faith to the patient, even if that's what the patient needs. I think about a hospice chaplain I met dealing with dying people who could not bring up his Christian faith unless someone asked him. That's what it means to live in a secular world. He says, viewing the process from one angle, one can quite validly say that secular humanism is irreligious in its effects. From another angle, it's equally valid to say that it allows for a cohabitation with religion under certain circumstances. That is, quarantine from real life. And this is where, as Christians, we cannot give in to the secular. We cannot limit the expression of our faith to simply our private sphere. No, we have every right to bring our faith into the public sphere, because secularism, atheism, humanism are religions. And when you study the philosophy of religion or the study or history of religions, religion is a worldview. It's about what you consider to be most valuable, what is ultimate, how does that shape our identity, where do we think that meaning comes from? All those religious ideas, and secularism tries to present those to us. He goes on page 80. Secularism is best seen as having two components. What is external and sociological, I'm calling secularization. What is internal and ideological, I am calling secularism. That is, secularization is this process in a society where God is pushed to the edge. Secularism is similar to humanism. It is a philosophy that denies God's reality. Page 87, secularism is the process that creates the public environment in which these values seem natural and inevitable. What values? The values of the modern age, where we have to be neutral in our society so no religion can be brought in. Think about the nature of public education. Teachers can impose LGBTQ ideology on their students. Students can learn about the Quran and about Islam, but they cannot be taught Christianity. The Bible cannot be read. You cannot promote that. That is secularization. It's a synonym for modernization. Secularization is that aspect of the modernizing process that produces the values of secularism. Secularization and secularism are related to one another as the glove is to the hand, or as the body is to the soul. The former, secularization, is the public environment created by the modernizing process that produces a conscious counterpart that is its echo, and in which the sound of God and of the transcendent order are never heard. The latter is the psychological reflex to our reshaped society. That's secularism. So this is the kind of stuff that, should you read this book? Yes, it is worth it even 33 years later. Now the context has changed a bit, but Wells's insight into understanding why the world is the way it is today is key. And he talks later in this chapter about the boiling of the frog. You know, if you want to boil a frog, you can't throw them in hot water. You got to start cold and heat it up. He talks all about that. I mean, this book is full of historical, theological, philosophical brilliance, and it is relatively easy to read because his writing is so clear. Wells' interesting character, grew up in Rhodesia. I think his father was a governor. And Rhodesia is what we now call Zimbabwe, destroyed country under British and Dutch rule in the southern part of Africa. There was actually, for many people, a better life, even though there was racial discrimination. But he grows up in Rhodesia, goes to school in South Africa, I believe, and then gets his degrees at University of London, Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, and his PhD at the University of Manchester in England. So he writes with that typical British insight, same kind of insight you'd get reading Carl Trueman or G.K. Chesterton or C.S. Lewis. The insight is really incredible. Something about the British mindset that enables that, especially in looking at America. Let me read some key passages here in this book. This book has so many great passages. He talks on page 59 about the illusions of progress. It is interesting that the illusions of progress, that is the idea that secularism and humanism and atheism are going to lead us to progress, religion held us back. This is a widely held view. And that because of evolution and humanism, we can only progress. Things are only going to get better. And it's amazing, 120 years ago, at the turn of the 20th century, you can read author after author, influential authors saying in the 20th century, because we now have, through the Industrial Revolution, through Darwinism, through Nietzsche and others, we have cast off religion. We are going to solve poverty. We're going to cure all diseases. We are going to enter the kingdom of man. It's going to be a paradise. They actually believe this. They wrote about this as if it was certain. I mean, technological advances then were coming so quickly. People were just thinking, what can man not do? And then you have World War I, the most industrial advanced nations of the world going to war and slaughtering millions. A few years later, 25 years later, World War II. Again, the most advanced nations of the world, going to greater and greater refinements of cruelty and weaponry to destroy. That's what kicked off the postmodern world. People became disillusioned. What can man not do? Can man do anything good? Can we trust institutions? It's belief in absolute truth that made people do this, World War I and World War II. And so postmodernism arose. So he says this illusion of progress that went hand in hand with these ideologies have managed to live on despite the fact that the ideologies themselves are now hiding embarrassment or have already passed onto the junk heap of history. What were those ideologies? Again, Nietzsche, God is dead. We don't need God. Darwin, we're progressing inevitably toward an incredible future. These are the kind of thoughts people had, and it led to destruction. Really, the best part of this book begins right after his chapter, Things Fall Apart. That's where it gets really interesting. He begins to talk about the loss of conviction, the loss of confession. And certainly this is something missing in many of our even good conservative churches, public confession of the faith. I'm thankful that I go to a church where every week we have responsive readings where we are reading the scriptures back and forth. There's congregational involvement beyond just singing. And we confess every week some element, some statement, some portion of a statement of faith. So that in the course of a year as a Christian, I am being discipled to remind myself of sound doctrine. I highly encourage this in our churches. But beginning in the chapter after things fall apart is some of his best reading. This is where he begins to talk about the decline and really the dumbing down nature of evangelical theology, evangelical education. I got to tell you, the educational standards of today do not measure up to a couple generations ago. We're handing out doctoral degrees to people that have just done a study of their church. We are handing master's degrees to people who have not mastered a subject at all. They've just taken a few classes. Read John Frame, the now retired theologian and apologist at Reformed Theological Seminary. The dumbing down of what, compared to what he went through in learning. Of course, we all know this. Most of us couldn't pass an 8th grade final exam from 100 years ago because it required knowing algebra and a little calculus and extensive vocabulary and logic and all that. So Wells talks about the dumbing down of our universities and our studies. He begins to talk about on page 128. This is the goal to the book in his chapter, Things Fall Apart. It's a really long chapter. He starts to say this. At one extreme are those who have recoiled into Anglo-Catholicism in reaction to pietistic subjectivism. That is, people that get really tired of the emotional, surface level, attractional churches tend to then swing the pendulum over to Anglicanism or Catholicism or even Orthodoxy because they long for something to be rooted. Most evangelical churches today never mention church history. You would think that they invented Christianity in the last 10 years. And people start to hunger. Thinking people say there's got to be more. There's got to be something rooted. Because when they meet someone who's Catholic or Orthodox, these people know their history and they can say, we've believed this for 2,000 years. That shakes the evangelical. He says, at one extreme are these who've recoiled into Anglo-Catholicism. At the other end are those who've taken their stand on the verities, the reliability, the stability of old-time fundamentalism as a way of rejecting evangelical softness. That's the world I grew up in, fundamentalism. There's a lot good to it. We had a passion for souls. We believed the Word of God, but there was a lot of quirky and wrong stuff, a very uninformed view of culture that really turned away a lot of people unnecessarily because they associated directly the views of culture with Christianity. He says, in between these far shores lie the choppy waters that most evangelicals now ply with their boats, think churches. And here the winds of modernity blow with disconcerting force, fragmenting what it means to be an evangelical. This is because evangelicals have allowed their confessional center to dissipate. This is one of Wells' key points in this book, and one of the most important. The average evangelical church has no confessional center. What I mean by that is they have no historic Christian confession that they're anchoring their identity, their preaching, their theology, their teaching to. As a result, and this is true of the churches I grew up in, that preached a lot of sound doctrine. But there was nothing we could look back to and say this confession encapsulates what we believe the Bible teaches. And as a result, then error crept in through strong personalities of pastors with big personalities or big churches. They would introduce error or corrupt the teaching of the Word of God with their own viewpoints because we had no confession to root in. Now, I understand sola scriptura, the authority of the Bible. I'm all for that. But the question is, which interpretation of the Bible? This is the value of historic creeds and confessions. Because we can look and say these creeds and confessions, starting with the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, all the way up through Westminster Confession of Faith or 1689 Baptist Confession of Faith, these were hammered out over hundreds of years. They are reliable sources of doctrine. Now, we might have reservations or say we disagree with them in some minor areas. But listen, folks, if there's no confessional unity to Christianity, then we are one step away from becoming a cult because we have nothing to anchor us to the historic Christian church. Jesus said, I will build my church, not I will build thousands of independent churches that will each teach their own little variety and brand. And what happens then in the absence of a confession of faith and a practice of use of that confession and creed, your beliefs become rooted around individuals, the pastor. So the pastor gains a following. And when he's gone, another pastor comes in and you have to adjust your theology because he has a different theology. And this pastor at this big church in the South or in the Midwest, they've built the biggest church in America, the biggest Sunday school. So they're the authority. What they say matters. And you're not building your theology and your beliefs on a consensus among a group of careful and well-trained people. You're building it on personalities. And see, that's the other thing about theology. Theology is not a study of God, as some people think. It's theo, God, logos. What is logos? It's a word about. So theology is discourse, conversation on God. Theology and the great creeds and confessions were formed as like-minded people who had the same convictions of the Bible came together and hammered these things out, sometimes over years, testing and examining and throwing out bad ideas and weak statements. Wells says, because evangelicals have rejected creeds and confessions, their confessional center has dissipated. He says this is a remarkable change when one considers the importance of doctrinal confession to the evangelicals' most numerous immediate forebears, the fundamentalists of 100 years ago. We just passed the 100th anniversary of the Scopes trial in Tennessee, in which almost overnight the nation of America turned against Christianity because of the dismal performance of William Jennings Bryan, who was outclassed by Clarence Darrow in this trial, which was a minor trial, but it was blown up. It was the first trial ever broadcast live over the radio. Every day, film was taken of the trial, driven to the local airport in Tennessee, flown to New York City, shown in theaters. Major newspapers reported on it. Scopes trial is a great book that I think captures the idea of the Scopes trial the best, The Summer of the Gods by Edward Larson. This trial was it was the culmination of decades of battle between Bible-believing Christians, professors, theologians, pastors, and the Darwinian liberal consensus that was coming out of Europe. And as a result of that, the fundamentalists, which was not a derogatory term among them, they considered it important because we believe the fundamentals of the faith. In the 20s, 30s, and 40s, these were strong, intellectually robust men who were educated at some of the finest universities in the world and had resisted liberalism. This includes names like J. Gresham Machen, who founded Westminster Theological Seminary when Princeton Theological Seminary went liberal, and included some of the greatest thinkers of the day. Wells says in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, fundamentalists were clearly cognitive aliens within the culture and often used doctrine to define their cultural boundaries. Doctrine served to seal in believers and to seal out unbelievers. That sounds so foreign to us today because we have developed this idea that church is for unbelievers and let's do whatever we have to get unbelievers to come to church. These men had clarity to realize church is for Christians, to train, to equip them, to go out and reach the lost. We've abandoned that in most churches. Now we're going to have big events and bring the community in. And I'm not against that per se, but that is basically the extent of most churches' outreach. Let's bring them to us. Come and see, not go and tell. Come and see is good, but it should be a minor part of the go and tell strategy of equipping Christians to go into their circles of friends, family, neighbors, coworkers, classmates. That's where it should be. And when you begin to lower the standards and begin to dilute your teaching so that unbelievers don't feel out of place, when you stop doing the Lord's Supper, except on rare occasion, you stop baptizing people except in this big celebration, this hoopla of baptism with pathetic, weak testimonies of salvation, if you're Baptistic like me. You start to treat church as if it's, this is where we're going to bring unbelievers. And you end up doing what a lot of churches do now, Sunday at the movies in July, all these gimmicks. We have churches in our area that have horse Sundays, and they bring horses up on the stage, and classic car show and truck pulls and all this. And listen, if that's part of your overall strategy where you're equipping your people to effectively engage unbelievers with the gospel, that's fine. I mean, not everything one of those. I don't think horses on stage at church are needed in any way. But when you read 1 Corinthians 14, and it talks about what should happen when an unbeliever comes into the church, visits a public meeting of the church, they hear the word and they're convicted and they fall on their knees and say, surely God is among you. See, it is the dissonance, the difference between everything else in a person's experience and church that should make that person stop and think, wow, I'm experiencing something that is so foreign and yet so captivating. I need to sit up and listen because I can't hear this anywhere else in society. So Wells praises the early fundamentalists of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s because they understood the church is for believers. It's to equip them. He says the assertion that the Bible should be read literally not only signaled the fundamentalist intention to take it seriously, but also, it would seem, to reject the whole raft of literary theory and critical chicanery that had made a mockery in learned circles of biblical inspiration. That is, the influence of liberalism out of Germany was deeply impacting churches in America, and they began to abandon belief in the literal truth of the Bible. Now, there's more to interpretation of the Bible than just the literal. In fact, if you just take the literal and divorce it from creeds and confessions, you're going to end up in error. We believe in the literal, grammatical, historical, but also covenantal, theological, biblical theology that sees a storyline through Scripture and recognizes the Bible is full of typology and allusions. So we don't want to eliminate that because we believe in the literal teaching of the Bible. But he says it was their commitment to the Bible as the Word of God that kept them in the truth. He says their doctrine drew a tight perimeter around their counter community, established a clear border. Rules emerged that warned the unwary as well as the adventurous where enemy territory lay. See, this is where the church of the 21st century is not interested in this book, because this book says there is danger out there. Now, we shouldn't become obsessed and think that, it's just us four and no more, and I'm not sure about you too, whether you're really Christian and faithful to God. But the truth is, liberal theology is destructive. Progressive theology is destructive. LGBTQ ideology is destructive. Radical neo-Marxist activism in the church is destructive. Charismatic mania and the idea that prophets and apostles have arisen is destructive to the church. So we need to have clarity on these things. And the truth is, a lot of churches, a lot of Christians, they don't want clarity, because they think, if we're clear, that might leave some people out and some unbeliever might get offended. So let's just be vague. Let's just be shallow and draw them in, and it'll be wonderful. It will not be wonderful, and David Wells shows why. He says, when we move from fundamentalism to evangelicalism, see, out of the 1930s and 40s, some fundamentalists became more and more pugnacious, fighting and more militant, and as a result, out of that grew in the 1940s this movement of new evangelicalism or neo-evangelicalism. They wanted to be softer. They didn't want to fight. And some of them were good. Some of them were conservative. But some of them also were already drifting. He said, when we move from fundamentalism to evangelicalism, however, we are moving from a counterculture, counter-community to a community. Fundamentalism was a walled city. Evangelicalism is a city. Fundamentalism always had an air of embattlement about it, of being an island in a sea of unremitting hostility. Yeah, that's true. That's the churches I grew up in. We were always fighting the world, and the world was always dangerous to us. And they overdid it, without a doubt. We became terrified and scared of any influence that was not Christian. So can't have Christian art. I mean, we can't have non-Christian art. So Thomas Kincaid, oh, he's a Christian. Okay, let's buy all his artwork. But unsaved artists, no. Can't have non-Christian music, so only Christian music counts. Like some fundamentalists went too far. And evangelicals, the new evangelicals, reacted to that. They wanted to welcome the world in more, but Wells says there was a problem with this. Again, fundamentalism always had an air of embattlement about it, of being an island in a sea of unremitting hostility. Evangelicalism, on the other hand, has reacted against the sense of psychological isolation. The new evangelicals don't want to be contending with the world. It has lowered the barricades. It is open to the world. The great sin of fundamentalism is to compromise, and that's true. Compromise was clearly the most evil thing you could do in the churches I was growing up in. And I'm thankful they taught that. Now, they went too far. Compromise, you grow a beard, that was compromise. You listen to John Denver or the Beach Boys, that was compromise. You read a translation of the Bible other than the King James, that was compromise. So clearly they went too far. But he says this, the great sin in fundamentalism is to compromise. The great sin in evangelicalism is to be narrow. In other words, new evangelicals just didn't want to oppose anything. And the new evangelicals of the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s are now the average evangelical church today. We don't want to be too narrow. We don't want to preach on sin. We don't want to have someone in that's controversial. Let's only have nice sounding messages. Let's not call out sin. Let's let the unbelievers who are committed to their sin come to our church and feel completely comfortable and never be convicted. Now, again, a lot of churches and pastors would not say that's what they're doing, but that is the impression you get when you attend. Wells goes on, the lowering of these barricades coincided, in fact, with a change in the psychological position of evangelicals within the culture, a change that brought them in from the cold. See, fundamentalists, because they were in such opposition to the culture, were left out. When you read the history of universities in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, Christians were no longer welcome, Christian professors. In the denominations, the liberals were winning, the conservatives were out, and they many times had to start their own new fellowship or denomination because they lost. I think about the founders of Westminster Theological Seminary, J. Gresham Machen and others. They controlled Princeton Theological Seminary and were continuing on in the legacy of B.B. Warfield and Alexander Archibald and Charles Hodge and others, this bastion of conservative theology. Harvard and Yale Divinity Schools were long gone. Princeton was holding firm, and then the board at Princeton reorganized and the faculty was cut out of control. And as a result then, J. Gresham Machen and others left Princeton Theological Seminary. All the buildings, all the history. Today, the endowment at Princeton Theological Seminary, last I heard, was over $1 billion. They walked away from it penniless. Now, by God's grace, J. Gresham Machen came from a wealthy family in Baltimore, and so he funded the start of Westminster Theological Seminary. But they started in a living room. They left these historic buildings, which had been there for 100 years, this campus that had this legacy. They had to walk away. This happened in a lot of places, where the liberals took over denominations and seminaries and universities and churches, and the conservatives lost power and had to walk away. Stunning. And yet they had the courage and conviction to do that. It left them out in the cold and made them part of an accepted, if informal, religious establishment. 1976, we have this turnaround. America woke up to find itself living in the year of the evangelical. I'm on page 130 of No Place for Truth. The popular media, which have an acute sense of who has the power and who does not, knew that something had changed, and that change was not simply that President Carter, who was indubitably born again, had made it to the White House. There was rather a sinking realization on the part of a profession known for its irreligion that a tradition that had been frequently discounted, except in the hills of Appalachia, had now become virtually ubiquitous. That is, evangelicals in the years where they lost cultural power, in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, had gone back to focusing on the bread and butter. Let's win souls, let's plant churches, and as a result, a massive growth in the Christian church in the middle of the 20th century. So 1976, Time magazine declares it the year of the evangelical. The liberals and progressives are shocked. We thought we had killed that years ago. And this massive resurgence, as sociologists begin to realize, there's a resurgence of church attendance, of those claiming to be Christian. There's growth in these little independent seminaries and Christian colleges, and that's the rise in the 50s, 60s, and 70s of Christian colleges, Christian schools. Christians went back to grassroots efforts and grew exponentially. They had no political power, no cultural power. Also on page 130, Wells says, overnight evangelicals began to be courted, their views given solemn attention, politicians at election time. Like birds anxious to mate, preen themselves before evangelical organizations. So things changed. And I'm going to end this first part of No Place for Truth. I was hoping to do one video, but I need to wrap it up here. I will pick up here on page 130 because there's still much more to say. And so much more to understand. And in this next video, the second half of this book, we're going to talk about David Wells' incredible prediction of a coming divide. I remember talking to him when I was on campus at Gordon Conwell as a pastor in the year 2000. I had him for a class, and I said, what is the divide, and when will it happen? This is in 2000. He said, Mark, I'm not sure, but there's a divide coming. Because of the nature of the different directions evangelicals coming, a divide will come, and it will come within a generation or so. And in the second half of this series, I want to point out what I think is the divide. And it's the same divide it's always been on the authority of Scripture. So I'll leave that with you. Come back for part 2 of this video.